God is omnipresent. God can be present anywhere or everywhere, omnipresent, in other words, at the same time. He can. So in Matthew 28, verse 20, we find that Jesus is present where two or three are gathered in his name. And we have the promise that Jesus is to be with us always, even unto the end of the world. And only God can do that. Jesus is holy, harmless, undefiled, and separate from sinners, according to Hebrews chapter 7, verse 26. Jesus did no sin, and neither was guile found in his mouth, according to 1 Peter 2, verse 22. And Jesus came to take away our sins, and in him was no sin. 1 John 3, verse 5. And Paul, writing in 2 Corinthians 5, verse 21, gives a description of Jesus who knew no sin. There's some people say that Jesus sinned, but there's some references, like the one we just mentioned, that tell us that Jesus had no sin. Christ held divine offices, and there is no creation except by the act of God. Since Christ created, he is therefore God, and that's in Hebrews chapter 1, verse 10. The Apostle John said the world was made by Jesus, and that was in John chapter 1, verse 10, and in verse 3. John said that all things were made by Jesus, and without him nothing was made. It is Christ that upholds all things in the world by his power, and he is therefore, or before all things. And by him all things consist. Not create things, not created, not a created being, but an eternal being. And for further information, look at Hebrews chapter 1, verse 3, and Colossians 1, verse 17. In Luke 7, verse 48, Jesus forgives sins, and only God can forgive sins. Jesus is called the Son of Man and has the power to forgive sins. That's in Mark 2, verses 5 through 10. And in John chapter 6, verses 39 through 40, we find that Jesus has the power to raise those that believe on him and give them everlasting life. Jesus has been given the office of all judgment. John 5, verse 22. And Jesus said in Revelation 22, verse 12, that he comes quickly and he will give to every man according to his works. And Jesus will judge believers at the judgment seat of Christ. And we find that in 2 Corinthians 5, verse 10. Jesus will judge all nations, as seen in Matthew 25, verses 31 through 32. And Jesus will judge the world in righteousness, according to Acts 17, verse 31. Jesus provides salvation and eternal security. You find that in John 10, verse 38, and chapter 6, verse 47. Jesus is from eternity to eternity. He has always been. Jesus was the eternal Son of the eternal Father. In Micah 5, verse 2, it states that it was Jesus who came forth, and his going forth have been from of old, from everlasting. Jesus said, before Abraham was, I am. And that's in John 8, verse 58. Christ promised the disciples that I am with you always, meaning that he is omnipresent, an attribute of God. And that's in Matthew 28, verse 20. Christ promised to indwell every believer, which is another proof of his omnipresence. And that's in John 14, verse 23, Ephesians 3, verse 17, Colossians 1, verse 27, and Revelations 3, verse 20. And I thank you for listening.